Ireland is currently one of the top richest countries in the world, but several years back it was just a small, impoverished country with little to no resources to boost its chances of survival. How did it go from being a third world country to being ranked as one of the richest in such a short period? In the 19th century, Ireland underwent major highs and lows, but the most significant of the lows was when the country was plagued with famine. That famine began a disastrous period for the country and its citizens. It also had a serious negative impact on the country's economy. Before the Great Hunger, as the famine was popularly known, Ireland was a country filled with farmers, and the lands were filled with lush potato fields. Although they were mostly subsistence farmers and didn't farm on a large scale, their citizens could feed well and live fairly well. Then the famine occurred. The once fertile potato fields were barren due to a pathogenic attack. The streets were filled with dying and hungry people, and there was no help anyone could render. This famine lasted for about 7 years, and almost 1 million people died, while another million migrated to find greener pastures. The impact of the death and migration is still felt to date, as the current population of Ireland is less than that of New York, to show how terrible that disaster was. In 1851, when the Great Hunger ended, things didn't get any better for Ireland as nothing was going right in the country. A major part of the workforce had either died or emigrated, and the government, which was then the British government, was making economic policies that in no way helped the country. Till the end of the century, Ireland was in an impoverished state. The beginning of the 20th century was not any better as Ireland struggled to gain independence from the British Empire. The British treated them like second-class citizens, and their country was not progressing, so they wanted to rule independently. In 1922, Ireland gained that independence. The Irish were beyond happy to gain independence and expected everything to get better soon after, but things didn't go as planned. After gaining their independence, they began taking steps to become industrialized. Farming became oriented around pasture rather than tillage. The country also increased its processing of exports and invested in the export business. The country gradually became electrified, including the Irish Sugar Company in Carlow, and new factories were encouraged. Besides that, they also studied economies to know which was the best to emulate. In their survey, they noticed that free economies like the United States were suffering from the Great Depression. Still, communist economies like the Soviet Union were thriving and experiencing rapid industrial growth. And because the latter seemed better, they went for it. So, Ireland began to implement protectionist policies to make the economy self-sufficient. They monopolized and nationalized their corporations and banned most foreign trade and investment in the country. It was not a smart move, but they didn't know at the time. The reason the policies worked for the Soviet Union at the time was due to their large population and their considerable number of natural resources. Ireland should have considered that when making the decision, since they had neither the resources nor the population, it didn't work for them. Around that period, they were also having issues with the British Empire. Although Ireland had gained independence, they were still paying land annuities to Britain, and in the late 1930s, it decided that it wouldn't pay it anymore. Britain fought against their decision, and it became a war known as the Economic War. The war ended in 1938, but the country struggled because many tariffs were placed on their goods during the war. Even though they also placed tariffs on British goods, they suffered more. Coupled with the protectionist policies, everything was going differently than they had hoped. The country struggled to get a balance, but in the late 1950s, things began to change for the good. Sean Lamass, the then leader of Ireland, realized that the economic policies they were using were not yielding the intended results. So he enlightened the others in government, and they began lifting trade barriers and encouraged foreign investment. Corporations that had already been nationalized were converted to private companies to increase efficiency. With low taxes, the government created a free economic zone outside Shannon Airport where companies could manufacture whatever they wanted without being taxed until they went to export it. Well, this attracted a lot of multinational companies. Houses were built to curb the housing crisis of that period, and the government also focused more on technology. Education also became a priority, and it started a free education program to increase the literacy levels of its citizens. A civil servant, T.K. Whitaker, also played an important role during that period. He created a blueprint in line with the country's decision to join the European Economic Community, the EEC, a forerunner to the European Union. In 1973, Ireland finally became a member of the EEC, boosting Ireland's economic prospects as they began trading with countries they had not initially traded with. As of 1970, before joining EEC, a huge amount of their exports had gone to Britain. But after it joined EEC, it reduced considerably. But that boom only lasted a short time. Not long after they joined EEC, things began to go wrong. There were industrial relations disputes, inflation from the oil crises of 1973 and 1979, new capital taxes, and poor management of the economy. The combined effect took a huge toll on the country, and by the 1980s, Ireland was referred to as the sick man of Europe. The 1980s was a horrible time for Ireland economy-wise. Everything that seemed to be falling in place just fell apart. The government made the situation worse by borrowing excessively and being highly corrupt. It was also a time of political instability, as there was a period when 3 elections were held in a year. Unemployment rates rose, and tax rates were also very high as 60%, which meant the cost of living was ridiculously high. People left the country to work in foreign countries, and foreign investors were also afraid to invest because of the high taxes, although some did. Apple set up its headquarters in the country, but it didn't make any difference as it didn't create jobs for the Irish. Well, this period lasted for a major part of the decade, but the beginning of a new decade saw a new dawn. In the 1990s, the Irish government was tired of all the challenges that came with the previous decade, so they decided to try a new tactic, and it was called the Taoiseach strategy. In this program, all the political parties made suggestions on how to overcome the economic crisis, and they were able to come up with incredible suggestions. From the Taoiseach strategy, the government deduced that they should cut spending and taxes. Lower taxes will encourage people to invest more, and it worked. Like a miracle, things began to change for the better. Companies were swarming to Ireland like bees to a flower because of the more favorable tax rates. But there was a little issue. The employment rates were not any better because strict labor laws made it hard for companies to hire and fire Irish workers as they pleased. So, what did the Irish government do? They began easing their policies concerning acquiring Irish workers, and the companies began hiring them immediately. The country was also one of those that launched the euro currency system in 1999. All the new policies and decisions worked, and the economy started improving. Besides the foreign companies, Irish people started creating their own companies too. In fact, the economy grew at a rate of 9 to 10% from 1995 to 2000, which was faster than any other economy during that period. Ireland was known as the Celtic Tiger for how fast it was able to pick itself up, despite the severe economic crisis it had faced just the decade before. It became recognized as one of the wealthiest countries. Then, in 2008, the world faced an economic crisis, and Ireland wasn't spared. The crisis particularly hit Ireland because of its connection with the United States and Europe. The crisis in Ireland was mainly due to the poverty bubble, which resulted from banks lending money to anyone with a low income to buy luxury real estate. The banks thought properties would continue to remain profitable and serve as solid collateral for the loan. But the opposite happened as the prices dropped drastically to 12.4% in 2008. In 2009, it fell by a further 18.6%. And in major cities like Dublin, it was down to about 5.65. It wasn't very good. Well, desperate times, they say, require desperate measures, and the Irish government was desperate to make things better. So, in 2010, they sought help from the IMF and European Union to help bail out their failing financial institutions. The rescue deal had the country putting in $17.5 billion, the IMF added $22.5 billion, and the EU added the same amount. The deal helped boost the country's economy, and in 2012, it started yielding results. By 2013, economic growth became visible. Although the loan from the IMF and EU helped, it came with a price, a costly one at that. The country had to shut down 41 government institutions and cut the salaries of civil servants by 14% to pay back the loan. From 2013, the economic growth was steady and things were improving. Then, in 2015, Ireland took the world by surprise when it announced its growth rate. It reported that the growth rate was a huge 25%. The question, how, was on everyone's lips. Even China, which has such a large population and is known as a manufacturing hub, never had such rates before. Economists returned to their textbooks because they just couldn't explain how it could have happened. Then the truth about it all came to light. What happened that year was famously described by Paul Krugman as leprechaun economies. What had really happened was that multinational companies like Microsoft and Apple, which had moved to Ireland due to the low tax rates, were also moving their profits. This money was reflected in their growth rate, but in actuality, it just sat in accounts and didn't directly affect the country's economy. For that reason, the country had to develop its own method of calculating its growth rate different from the usual GDP, known as the modified gross national economy. Despite the new method of calculating, it was certain that Ireland's economy was thriving. As years went by, Ireland began to create new policies like incrementing their corporate tax rate, and many thought the companies would leave as a result. But that didn't happen, as they established themselves in the country and couldn't just leave. The conditions were still also favorable. Ireland is currently an airline powerhouse and a major exporter of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and software-related goods and services. The country had barely anything, but could make a name for itself due to its stable political and economic system. Well, thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.